Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this, the first Global Strategy Forum event of 2022. And we are here in the National Liberal Club. My name is Richard Barrons. I'm a member of the advisory board to the Global Strategy Forum, and I'm your host for today's event. With a bit of luck, today will be the last fully remote event for the Global Strategy Forum, as we hope to return starting next week to a hybrid formula with people in the National Liberal Club availing themselves of the excellent sausages and many others, we hope, continuing to join remotely where that suits them. Let me start by introducing our speakers for today, led by Bridge Colby, who is joining us by Zoom from a rather sunnier and warmer Florida. And here in the National Liberal Club, Gideon Rachman, who will follow Elbridge in our opening remarks. The purpose of today is to talk about Bridge's new book, which is called The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Power Conflict, published just last year. And that is going to raise very many pertinent questions that will relate to events we're seeing today, both in Indo-Pacific and also, of course, in Ukraine. But before we get into the meat of the day, there are some parish notices, as usual. The first one is our next event will be on Tuesday, the 1st of February, again at 1 o'clock. And Sir Mark Grant, known to many of you, I think, as a former national security advisor and our ambassador to the United Nations, he will be here in conversation with Lord Stirrup, known equally well to many as a former chief of the defense staff and also on the GSF advisory board. And the subject will be Britain in the 2020s, national security challenges in a changed world. The invitations for that have gone out and will be in your inboxes. Returning to today's event, it's a view-only webinar. So we plan to take some live audio questions. So if you want to ask a question, you will either be able to do it yourself by unmuting when I ask you, or you can submit it for me to read out if you put read in front of your question, and we'll see how the technology goes. Today's event will be recorded and you'll be able to see it in due course on our YouTube channel, which is on our website. That's globalstrategyforum.org, all in lowercase. And for those of you on Twitter, the event will be on our Twitter account, which is #GSF Events Day. So turning to today's event, let me introduce our speakers. First of all, Bridge Colby. He is co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. And this indeed is the subject of his new book, Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. This has been selected by the Wall Street Journal as one of the top 10 books of 2021. He is steeped in his subject, both as a government insider working as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018, as a policy thinker in the Center for New American Security, and as an operator on the field, for example, in Iraq in 2003 with the Coalition Provisional Authority and in setting up the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the US. Seated alongside me here, Gideon Rachman, who many of you will know very well as the Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator for the Financial Times. He writes a weekly column for the FT and hosts an international affairs podcasts. His main interests are geopolitics in Asia, US foreign policy, and the future of the EU. He's a prize-winning journalist, and he's written 3 books, of which the latest is Age of the Strongman, How the Cult of the Leader Threatens Democracy Around the World, a theme that I think echoes very widely even today. And he is going to return to the GSF, we hope, to talk about this book in the spring. He's a regular public speaker, appearing before both academic and business audiences. So the formula for the rest of the session today is I'm going to ask Bridge to spend 10 minutes setting out his thesis based on his book. I'll then ask Gideon to respond again in about 10 minutes. I will then try and conjure up a spirited conversation between the three of us as we throw the floor open to the Global Strategy Forum to raise your questions either in person by unmuting or in written form if you prefer. So without delaying any further, let's turn to Bridge. Bridge.
Great. Well, thank you, General Barrons. Thanks to the Global Strategy Forum and thanks to Gideon Rachman for participating. It's really a privilege to have such a distinguished panel here to talk about my new book and the issues it raises, which I think, as General Barrons suggested, is especially pertinent given what's going on in Eastern Europe. I'll try to be brief so that we can preserve as much time for conversation and questions. I mean, the basic motivation of this book, stemming from my experience in the Pentagon when I led the development of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which tried to shift the United States towards a great power competition, particularly vis-a-vis China, is reckoning with the reality of, as economists would say, a new sort of scarcity of power and military power, particularly with respect to the range of potential threats that the United States and, most relevantly, its alliance network faces. Obviously, as this audience is familiar with, the United States has well over 30 allies scattered across Eurasia, basically. And the fundamental fact of the matter is, unlike the era of 1990s or the 2000s, we no longer have a military that can deal with the range of those threats. Obviously, there's the North Korea, Iran, terrorism, Russia, China, naturally, but the list could go on. If you'd ask John Bolton, he might include Venezuela, Cuba, et cetera. But as defense specialists in the United States and military officers know very well, we don't have a military that can do all these things on our own. And at least at this point, our allies are not, have not developed military sufficient to compensate for the gap. So how do we deal with this problem as Americans? And of course, I'm hopefully in an enlightened self-interest way, but I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the American citizen and his or her long-term interests. In that context, I think it's critical to have a strategy. And by a strategy, I don't mean a clever plan, which is kind of often how it's used, but rather a sort of an optimizing or simplifying framework in the same way that a business might approach a competitive environment in which it needs to make decisions in uncertainty and in scarcity. And in that context, the motivating idea is really to get back to basics. I mean, my view is that we have really become unmoored over the last generation since the collapse of the Soviet Union. We need to really get back to basics in a very concrete way. And of course, I think the political situation in the United States only undergirds that, as does the sort of power situation in the world. But for, when we're thinking about war and peace, needless to say, I think we need to, I'm a Clausewitzian in a lot of ways. You need to proceed from a reasonable political strategy in the sense of what we're trying to accomplish in the world. And this is the logic of denial. So I kind of think of denial as being three references. One is we've been in a state of denial for a number of years. And I think this administration is actually in quite a bit of denial actually right now about the limits on our resources and the need for hard choices. Secondly, denial is basically the purpose of our geopolitical strategy. So if we think about it very concretely, I think the purpose of American foreign policy should be to deny any other state such power in the international system that they could intrude on and essentially coerce and undermine our national life. So if we're thinking, as Lincoln said, it's unlikely that some giant is going to step across from Eurasia and invade the United States. We have two oceans, nuclear arsenal, et cetera. But what I do think could happen, and this is actually an idea I'm thinking of expanding on my future work, is that you could have a state basically with such power that it could undermine our prosperity, our security, our secure prosperity, and then use that to undermine our freedoms. And in some sense, that's already happening, and certainly happening to others like Australia, despite their noble stand. I can get into that more if people are interested. But basically, we want to deny that. So if we look at the world, then we should look at where the most power is and where the most powerful potential hegemons are, regional hegemons. Obviously, global power is clustered and has been for many years, but it's changing. It's clustered in a few areas. And by far, the most important of these is Asia. So, Asia, depending on how you define it, is going to be well over 50% of global GDP, and that share is increasing. Europe, which was the primary theater of international politics for a number of centuries, is no longer, as Joseph Borrell himself said, in 20 years, Europe will be about 10% of global GDP. So its fraction is declining. North America is important because essentially of the United States itself. So Asia is the most important theater. If we allow some entity to gain a dominant position in Asia, it would be able, if we're all working for the Asian market in some way, then it would be able to intrude on international life. And unfortunately, the most plausible regional hegemon in the world is also in Asia, and that's China, which is upwards of 20% of global GDP or power using standard metrics, far more powerful than any other state in the international system, with the exception of the United States itself, far more powerful than Russia, which, while it is able to translate its relatively limited economic base into a high level of geopolitical and military influence, is nonetheless constrained in how much even it could hope to dominate Europe. I mean, it's not even the largest state in Europe. I mean, Germany is by conventional metrics. So China, and denying China regional hegemony over Asia must be our overriding goal, and everything else needs to be put behind it. And I think it's pretty clear that this is at minimum what the Chinese are pursuing. In fact, many people criticize my arguments because I underestimate China's ambitions. If this is the case, how do we block it in a way that's consistent with Americans' cost and risk tolerance? Well, it's got to be a coalition. It's old school. I call it an anti-hegemonic coalition, which is a little clunky, but I think it defines the problem correctly. It's essentially a negative motivation, but that allows for a high degree of ecumenism, and it keeps us focused on what the real problem is. And in a sense, this is already coming together. Actually, I don't think we need an Asian NATO. In fact, I wouldn't want to create an Asian NATO for a variety of reasons. But it's a sort of a loose mix of informal and formal links. Primarily countries in Asia, because they're most threatened by China, so they're most motivated, and most of the strongest countries in the future will be in Asia: India, Japan, Australia, and others is the Quad. But then you're seeing Japan, Australia links, others like Taiwan, probably South Korea over time. This is this anti-hegemon, and as I said, it's actually coming together in this. Started probably under the Trump administration, but the Biden administration has continued it. This is to the good. The bad news is, of course, China is alive to this reality and has options. Now, I think they're using their economic leverage. They're trying to use their economic leverage to pry apart this coalition. But I actually think our experience and their experience thus far indicates the limits of economic power for coercive purposes. I mean, you look at Australia, actually, they're standing up to China. And even there was a Wall Street Journal article about China finding the limits of its economic influence, even in places like sub-Saharan Africa. So, can get into that, but basically China can accept that there are significant limits on its economic power, or it can look to other instruments. And in that context, it has a very, very formidable military. And the Chinese military is no longer what's called an anti-access area denial military alone. It's very rapidly, increasingly become what you call a power projection military. Aircraft carriers, space architecture, nuclear attack submarines, long-range aviation, marine and air assault forces. I mean, they're exploring a base in Equatorial Guinea on the Atlantic coast of Africa. I mean, I was shocked actually that they're that far along. But I mean, the Chinese continue to produce examples faster than I can imagine them. So maybe that's the poverty of my imagination, but I think that's the world in which we're living. Now, China's incentive in this context is not to precipitate World War III out of Hitler style. Rather, it wants to achieve regional hegemony, but without mobilizing all of its potential opponents together and incurring the costs and substantial risks involved. Rather, my view is that what China's most dangerous, best strategy is a kind of focused and sequential strategy, basically using its military and other forms of leverage to laser focus on particularly vulnerable parts of this coalition, especially ones tied to the United States, given the importance of U.S. differentiated credibility, I think of it. And then, causing that targeted state to disaffiliate and be subordinated to China's hegemony, and then essentially causing a run on the bank of that anti-hegemonic coalition's credibility, and particularly that of the United States, which plays a critical role I think of it as a kind of a cornerstone balancer in that anti-hegemonic coalition in Asia. And this is a very real possibility. In fact, it seems to be what they're preparing for. As Xi Jinping said recently to the PLA, I want you to prepare for an actual war. And they talk about what do they call it? A limited war, essentially under highly informationalized conditions. So this is what they're making reforms to fight a real war against the Americans. And look at the Google Earth images of what they're doing in the Western desert. You can see that they're in earnest. And of course, their nuclear buildup is consistent with that. So this is the problem. The problem is it's a very good strategy and they're prepared for it. Meanwhile, we've afflicted with our hubris and other problems have not focused despite many attempts to try to do so. And the situation in the Western Pacific is very severe and it's growing worse. Admiral Davidson, of course, famously earlier last year indicated that we may already be entering a window. Others are actually even more urgent vis-a-vis Taiwan. Happy to talk particularly about Taiwan, which I do think is the front end, is the kind of raggedy edge, but worth defending for the United States. The third and final meaning of denial is a military strategy of denial, which means what is our goal against this strategy? Well, it's deny China's ability to subordinate one of those allies and force it out of the coalition. That's actually a relatively low standard from a political point of view, but it's a very high standard from a military point of view, because we're talking about defending countries that are 100, 200 miles from the coast of China, 5 or more thousand miles from our shores. And yes, we have forward posture in the Pacific, but it's antiquated and very vulnerable, as is now well understood. So we really need to focus. We haven't done so. I actually think we've missed the opportunity for a graceful shift where we have balance. I think the people who are talking about balance in the American foreign policy debate are not reckoning with reality. And so I'll get to the point as I close, is the implications are profound. We don't have a military that's large enough, and the Biden administration is not increasing the defense budget. I don't think there's a lot of appetite for a big increase in the defense budget. Not increasing the defense budget. We don't have large enough to simultaneously operate effectively in multiple theaters. We can keep residual forces, but we need to focus. We have a one war military, and we're not even winning the one big war that we're supposed to, according to the war gaming, which is the one in China and Asia. So I think we're basically at the point where we're going to start to need to really drop commitments in other theaters, and it's very pertinent right now. The United States should not be doubling down in Europe. That would be a huge mistake, but it looks like maybe what the Biden administration is going to be doing, which could have profound effects in Asia. And I think this is in the US interest, but it's actually also in Europe's interest not to do this, because we're continuing the problem. We're essentially continuing the alcoholic problem, or pick your metaphor, which is largely about European allies other than the United Kingdom, which certainly does its part, but European allies not stepping up and assuming the burden of the conventional defense of Europe, which is well within their capacity. And this is mostly about Germany, and we needed intense coordinated pressure on Germany to step up and live up to its historic and contemporary responsibilities, which it did do when it was West Germany, when it was directly threatened. And this is a really important opportunity to do so right now. The United States can help, but we cannot continue to do Europe, try to pretend that we can do Europe and Asia. I wish we weren't in this position, but we've neglected the problem too long. And this is where things stand. So with that, I look forward to the conversation.
Elbridge, thank you very much. Before I turn to Gideon, could I ask you just to pick up on one phrase you used? You used the phrase, the United States differentiated capability. Could you just very briefly define what you mean by that?
Sure. I have a kind of a middle position on the issue of credibility. So I think there's what I would consider the sort of super hawk, or high-powered neoconservative view, which is that the U.S. credibility is always on the line everywhere, and it's totally connected. And I just don't think that's real. I mean, but the other side is academic and others with kind of come home America types who say that credibility doesn't matter. Countries will just pursue their interests. I also don't think that's true. You have to get a credit report to get a mortgage. I'm sure it's the same in the United Kingdom. My view is it's in the middle, which is basically what matters here is countries in Asia, which are going to be under Chinese threat. And they are going to look at how reliable the United States is for them, which is mostly about how we behave towards China and Asia. So actually, people are saying, particularly the sort of hawkish crowd in the United States, saying, well, we have to fight in Ukraine in order to convince Japan or whoever that we'll fight for Taiwan. But this is actually wrong. In fact, it's actually the opposite, in the sense that given that we have limited power, if we committed in Europe, it will actually make them less likely to go along, right? Because we have scarce resources. So what we really need to focus on is ensuring that we do stand up against China and Asia and have the capacity. It's not just about our willpower. We now have limited capacity. And this is a very important point. But by the same token, this actually increases the importance of how you behave in the primary theater. So Taiwan takes on even more importance, because if we stand up against the Russians in Ukraine or the Baltics, it's not going to matter, but it does matter. People are really looking. Tokyo, Manila, Seoul, Hanoi, New Delhi, Canberra, they're all looking at how we behave about Taiwan, because it gives them a reliable indicator of how they'll be treated when they're under a certain similar degree of threat.
Thank you. So Gideon is looking typically thoughtful, and I'm just going to ask him to respond.
Trick I've mastered, looking thoughtful, but no. So that was very interesting. Both the presentation and the book are very challenging. I find it convincing to some extent, actually, but I think probably it's more interesting in the terms of debate if I try and pick up on the bits that are at least open to question, put the other side of the argument. And I think that in a way, what's happening in Ukraine very much does put the other side of the argument. And this whole question that Bridge correctly identifies as credibility, how does one, what you're doing in one theater affect another? Before going directly at that, I'd note that I think that this belief on the need to, as some used to call it, pivot to Asia, has been in Washington for probably a decade, really, since at least Obama won in 2008. But it's proved consistently hard to do. And I think that is because there are other problems. They may not be as important long-term as China, but they're not problems that you can ignore. And secondly, I think that there is something to this credibility argument. Maybe there shouldn't be. Maybe people are silly in seeing reads across, but they tend to make an overall assessment of, is America looking strong or weak? And I think that that as a result there is a connection. But just looking at the history of the effort to pivot, one important episode I think came in 2013 when Obama decided not to intervene in Syria, went backwards and forwards and refused to bomb. And personally, I thought, and I suspect maybe Bridge Colby thought, that was probably the right call, that America was too involved in the Middle East and so on. But the backlash was really quite striking that, you know, that was still a time when one could travel a lot. And that decision was interpreted, and I thought over-interpreted all over the world as an indication of America pulling back, of American weakness. And then a year later, you do get Putin intervening in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and so on. Can you say there was a direct connection with the failure to intervene in Syria? Probably not, but I think there's such a thing as a sort of global atmosphere. And the global atmosphere was affected, even if, as I say, personally, I thought Obama made the right call, but people jump to conclusions from these kinds of things. And there is this, you know, that terrible old Osama bin Laden statement about the weak horse and the strong horse. If America begins to look like the weak horse, then I think people in Asia, actually, some of its allies in Asia, won't take what may be the rational view that Bridge Colby lays out, which is, well, great, this just means they're going to concentrate on us, and this is where it really matters. I think, on the contrary, you'll get people saying, we can see the way the wind is blowing. And frankly, I think even the reaction in China would be quite interesting. Now, of course, you know, both Russia and China, to some extent, are sort of black boxes. We don't really know how the decisions are made right at the center. But they do have something like public opinion, and China has a strongly nationalist public opinion. If you read things like the Global Times or translations of the blogosphere or whatever, there's a lot of sort of people saying, this is our time, you know, we should move in on Taiwan now. Now just imagine if Putin does get away with it in Ukraine, whatever that means. Are these people going to say, well, we should be more cautious now because this means America's going to concentrate on Taiwan? Or are they going to say, you know what, America's pulling back, they're a paper tiger, now's the time? That could be a hideous miscalculation, it probably would be. But that's not to say that they wouldn't make it. I mean, to draw an analogy from the 1940s, Japanese thinking about whether to attack the United States was significantly affected by what was happening in Europe. And when Hitler conquered France and so on, there was this sense that, well, the democracies are looking weak. And, you know, it was a crazy leap to then say, now's the time to attack the United States. But there was a sense that things are moving globally in a certain direction. And my worry about an American non-reaction or Western non-reaction on Ukraine would be not that people would say, okay, this means they're really concentrating on Asia. It would be that actually America is looking a bit weak. And I think also that, to wind up, I think that in his, I think, correct urge to make the case for the centrality of China to all of us in the future of the world and its overriding importance, I think Bridge may underplay the significance of events in Europe. It's not like it's a complete either or. What happens here also matters. Europe is not an economic irrelevance. It's certainly not to the US economy, or a strategic irrelevance. And although it's correct to say the Europeans should step up, will they? If the Americans pull out, I think, or radically reduce their commitments, I don't think you might get some effort to increase European defense spending, but I think more you'll just get a sort of demoralization in Europe, a kind of throwing up of hands, and even the question of German rearmament. You know, we don't like a sort of semi-pacifist Germany, but would we really like a Germany that was pouring money into its military, given European history, given the tension? I mean, regardless of what the French and the British would think about that, maybe we'd be fine with it now these days. But what would the Russians think about it? The increase in tensions there would be pretty severe. So look, there aren't any easy answers. This isn't meant as a refutation of the book, but just as saying it's really, really complicated. And I don't think there is a simple strategy where you can say, okay, this is the winning strategy, this is the one we're going to choose. I think anything we do could go wrong. And as a result, I suspect there's going to be a degree of improvisation in response to what the other side are doing, the other sides are doing, as much as what we would like the world to look like.
Thank you. So I'm going to exercise my privilege as chairman to ask a first question. I'm going to ask an easy one. Now, the book devotes a lot of space to setting out the criteria for establishing a regional balance of power in Asia to manage China's ambitions and options. And as we sit here today, we have NATO considering its new strategic concept to be launched at the Madrid summit in June, and the European Union talking about its strategic concept and its strategic autonomy rather, and its new compass. So based on both of your remarks and your views, what would you like to see NATO and the EU saying and doing now to fit with the thrust of having to manage the role China is going to play in our world? And we'll start with Bridge.
Great. Well, thank you, General, and thanks to Gideon Rachman for those very thoughtful comments. And in fact, I mean, you know, that's the spirit in which I wrote the book. There are not easy answers, and there's no certainty. I mean, just to step back a little bit, I mean, there's different roles in a sense in the policy process writ large. And what I have seen is essentially a market need there for this kind of deductive framework and allow us to think, because there's a tremendous amount of sort of muddling through an inertia. I think all the points that you mentioned are true, but they're dominating a policy. And you're right, the pivot has been a total failure. And that's for a number of reasons. Well, certainly the pivot of the Obama administration was a failure for a number of reasons. And even the attempt under the Trump administration has been uneven because of the Middle East and so forth. So you're absolutely right. And my partner and great friend, Wes Mitchell, I think he's really put it very well. A lot of this is going to be about what is our policy in what I think of, and I think are truly secondary or tertiary theaters, because we can't ignore them, but we have to put on this kind of framework, the correct sort of heuristic, I think, of understanding where we need to focus and what the power relationships are. And that's what I'm trying to do with this book. I don't have point solutions, but I think your point about the need to think through this is absolutely right. But the problem is that inertia has been dominating. You see it now with the Biden administration. So, you know, in some sense, paradoxically, being strong in these secondary theaters as you go out is critical. I mean, the Soleimani raid, I wasn't, you know, I didn't know about it beforehand, and that might be ex post facto, but in a sense, how you shift out is critical. But it is possible. That's one of the things. I mean, actually, the British example before World War I, when, as Wes points out, they settled disputes with Japan, Russia, France, and the United States itself in order to focus on Germany. So it is possible, but this kind of nature of the dismount is critical. I also would say on the credibility point, just briefly, I think you're right. I would think about that because it's not like there's, you know, spread the peanut butter versus focus on Asia. There's also the kind of feckless retrenchment or what have you. And I think where credibility is global is, as I think you're suggesting, it's actually more about telling about the particularities of a given administration, frankly. And that's where I think the Afghanistan actually, I thought, was the right decision, ineptly handled, but it tells people about the nature of decision-making. I mean, in the way that maybe Khrushchev in Vienna with Kennedy, it gave him a read on this individual who's very important, right? And that helped to lead to Cuba and so forth in the Berlin crises. So I think that's true, but I don't think that, I mean, the proof is, Japan is continuing to step up after the Afghanistan withdrawal. So it's possible, but in a sense, policy is going to, what's going to be the difference between success and failure. There are these tectonic plates, but I think what you're pointing out is we need to have an actual approach, and that's where the sort of the kind of day-to-day policy is so critical. And I also say, to your last point about where collective defense would go, at the end of the day, and I conclude the book with this, if that happens, we need to pivot away from Europe anyway. And if Europe has a security vacuum, that's got to be on the Europeans' shoulders. And I think that's going to be inevitable. In fact, I think what we risk is, by neglecting the problem, we risk an East of Suez moment where the Chinese act on Taiwan, for instance, or something like that, and we finally grapple with our constraints and then just abandon other commitments, which would be bad. That would be incompatible with. But by acting as if we're still in 1999, we actually raise the risks of an East of Suez moment. General, to your excellent questions, my view is, and it's informed by my assessment of the political realities in Europe, and I mean, again, I approach this from a kind of, I would say, conventionally realist point of view, is that countries, it's not all for one for all, despite what Secretary Blinken kind of, and actually I think the president himself at the Munich Security Conference. It's not going to be a league of democracies. It's not going to be three musketeers. And Germany's behavior is a perfect illustration of this. It's going to be more self-interested. Obviously, there are elements where ideology can be helpful, but we can't expect too much. We should work with countries' interests where they're most engaged and their capabilities are highest. And in that context, I don't think we should try to bring the boys along for a ride from Europe in Asia. And so I don't want NATO or the EU to be saying, we're going to send vessels into the South China Sea or whatever. And I've told the UK government this about the tilt and so forth. My view is, if you can cover down in Europe and maybe the Near East, that would be a huge help, because that would free up forces for us in Asia. And then we can contribute those fungible, kind of globally deployable or unique high-end capabilities that only we can provide. But I mean, political level, economic scale, I think, yes, China's critical. But from a security point of view, I think NATO should really just focus on securing itself and maybe its immediate environs. And I think I'm sympathetic, honestly, to a much stronger European role. What's frustrating a little bit, and I have an event with some French friends in a couple of weeks, so I make the point directly to them, is I don't quite understand President Macron's approach, because the optimal strategy, it would seem like, for France and Europe, strong Europe people, is to say, we'll work with you. We're basically aligned. Help us out. Give us capacity, and in return, America would give more discretion to Europe. That's the deal that I think should be on the table. But the French, by saying, no, it's going to be autonomous, and then they expect us to help them. It's ridiculous, because if Europe is going to try to be a third pole, our incentive is going to be to work with individual countries. Obviously, the UK, which we always work with, but Poland, Italy, name your other countries. That's what our incentive is going to do. So, unfortunately, this is another area where but instead, the administration is going in the approach of one for all for one, and reassuring. I mean, the president said today or yesterday, I don't want European allies to worry. I mean, that's exactly the opposite of what we want. We want Europeans to internalize that there is a threat that they need to materially contribute to addressing.
Gideon.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I mean, I just think that on this question of autonomous European defense and so on, I think that there's been a gradual shift. I was kind of marked by being in Brussels in 2003 in the Iraq War, when, of course, the old Europe versus new Europe, as Rumsfeld defined it, and there was enormous hostility to the idea of European defense initiative. The summit of Pralines had to be held in a hotel because they couldn't happen on NATO soil. And I think since then, although as Bridge points out, there's still, possibly because of this history, wariness, particularly to a French-led initiative on this. I think that the Democrats in particular, is my read in it, basically think that, if the way of getting Europeans to spend more on defense is to say there's an EU pillar to NATO, formal or informal, that's fine, that's good. There are lingering political question marks about, well, is France's ultimate vision that the United States is almost as much a problem as Russia? I don't think it quite is, but I mean, I'm dramatizing, but this idea that, it's a prelude to really breaking up the Atlantic Alliance. I think if that were the case, as Bridge says, half of Europe would bail out. And therefore, I think it's not even if that were a French pipe dream, it just would so much be a non-starter that they would have to surely package it in a way that makes it compatible with the continuing Atlantic Alliance. And if they can do that, then I think that's probably you know, a positive development. But it's been hanging around a long time. You know, almost 20 years now. We've been batting these ideas backwards and forwards.
Bridge, in the book, you say at one point that the issue of Chinese regional hegemony is an existential issue for China, but it's not an existential issue for the US or for Europe in the same way. And you also point out that the massive costs that would come with the escalation of that discussion into actual conflict. And here in Europe and elsewhere, we have populations that have very much enjoyed the benefits of globalization and are very protective of a very rich social offer, and frankly don't feel the fear. And you can see that even in the Ukraine discussion. So speaking as a highly accomplished policy advisor, and I'll come and ask Gideon as a senior commentator in a moment, how do we make the populations that we're talking about in the US and Europe understand this problem sufficiently to be motivated enough to want to demand different solutions with their taxes, for example?
Well, thank you. I'm honored. It's such a critical question. One of the things I really tried to do in the book, which I don't think is very frequent now, is always keep close to what the political constraints and degree of support would be, which and to, you know, Clausewitz, the famous line is, of course, that, you know, war is an extension of politics by other means. But the other point is, he says every military objective or action should always have the political objective in mind. And in a sense, that's what I tried to do, because we can't take that for granted. It's actually a malleable issue, in a sense, a manipulable issue. I don't mean that in a sort of propagandistic way, but how the opponent is seen. I mean, I think Gideon mentioned Japan 1941. My favorite example of this is, you know, if Japan had just attacked the European colonial possessions and left the American territories and homeland or territories alone, would the American people, A, have even been willing to go to war, but B, go to war in the way that was necessary? I really question that. But the way the Japanese pursued their objective led to a political result that itself had military effects. Now, I proceed, as I said, from a kind of realistic assessment, which is, you know, Kissinger has some great line, I think, in Diplomacy, where he says, you know, significant strategic shifts, it's more elegant than this, significant strategic shifts can't just be acts of virtuoso, they have to reflect underlying realities. And so I think we need to work with reality. In Europe, people are not really feeling threatened, but in Asia they are. You know, I mean, obviously Japan has a complicated history, but I mean, you look at the Japanese government, there's been dramatic shifts, and that's because they're neighbors, they're nearby, right? It's pretty straightforward. And actually in America, and I'm happy to talk more about that. I mean, I was talking to a, you know, pretty prominent Republican politician recently who was pointing out that actually China is much more of an issue, in a sense, in the base among voters than it is often in the elite. And I think Gideon was referring to Republicans, and I said, I think that's how it, but there's a lot of movement, you know, within the Republican Party, as there is on the Democratic side, I mean, across the political spectrum, as we, I think, grapple with this fundamental realities. And this is, you know, I would say the bottom line here is that being attuned to these realities is one of the reasons that the requirements of the shift to Asia are so serious. So in practice, the decision, I would say, is between a kind of, let's keep the balance, you know, let's keep doing Europe and keep doing the Middle East. And yes, we'll do China and Asia, but our strategy there will be a mix or sort of a balance of denial, right? Like direct defeat of a Chinese invasion, you know, think of 1940, the Battle of Britain kind of thing. Some of that, but it's not perfect, but also cost imposition, sanctions. And you can see the Biden administration working out this, you know, and international opprobrium. I don't buy that. I don't think that's going to be sufficient. I think China's too strong and too resolute to be, if they saw that that's actually how we would respond, they would be much more likely to go for it. What I want is denial, because I don't think the American people, or frankly our allies, particularly in Europe, will support like a societal level, you know, kind of war of societies, economic blockade, especially if the war hasn't developed in a certain way, right? Things that became plausible in 1944 and 1945 were not thought to be plausible in 1939 or in our Civil War the war that was fought in 1861, 1862, much different than the war that was fought in 1864, 1865. Because of this, I want a higher military standard, but that itself creates more of a demand signal. And that, in a sense, I think is where the real debate in the United States is. But it's precisely that, because I don't expect, when the chips are down, I don't expect Europeans to make maybe even any direct military contribution, certainly not a material military contribution to the scenarios that we have to worry about, which is Taiwan right now. I mean, European forces couldn't even probably operate on their own in the theater in a meaningful way. So I think that, I mean, in a sense, it could even be a net negative for us, because it would draw away logistics and sustainment and so forth. So I think that's where the real nub of the issue, and this is when I look at the administration's upcoming national defense strategy, that's my suspicion, is that they're going to end up in this kind of fudging the waters. But, you know, I mean, I don't need to tell you, General, but, you know, for want of a shoe, the kingdom was lost. I mean, in 1940, you can have dramatic political effects because of narrow military advantages. And I mean, sorry to go on, but the historical analogy to me that's most resonant is the wars of German unification, where you had dramatic systemic geopolitical effects that were, you know, against hundreds of years of European practice, because of relatively small wars by the standards of European, much smaller than the Napoleonic Wars or the wars of Austrian succession or the subsequent wars. But that can happen, and it can happen quite quickly, and that's what I'm afraid of.
I'm going to turn to Gideon, and then I'm going to try for a question one way or another from the audience.
Yeah, well, I won't detain you much longer. I think that is a rational fear about big political shift from relatively small military events. And I do think that if China were to conquer Taiwan, not that would be so small, you know, you'd have a dramatically different Asia. Just on the question you raised about, are we as societies prepared to spend and sacrifice enough to support a military? I think that is a big legitimate question. I've been a bit surprised actually by how much America's been prepared to sustain, you know, in terms of losses, spending, etc. It's a lot more than Europeans for a society that's, you know, sometimes portrayed as, you know, very consumer oriented, etc., etc. And, you know, when we hear the Russians deployed, what is it, 105,000 troops? Well, what's the size of the entire British Army? It's now like 70,000, I think, something like that. And, you know, you can decry, well, it should be larger, but, well, you'll know this much better than me. So I say there's a certain nervousness, but, you know, I gather it's just very, very hard to recruit people. You know, even if we had the money to have more soldiers, people ain't joining up that much in the kind of society we've created. And somebody said to me that you know, some of the soldiers they're recruiting have reading ages of 10, 11, because it's so hard to get people to sign up for that kind of life. And maybe that's a tribute to the kind of society we produced, and that you know, it's quite a comfortable life people are offered. But yeah, it's a big question for all of us.
So we won't go into military recruiting today. Safe to say that war is a great recruiting sergeant in history. And the absence of it makes it a bit harder, but we're not talking about that today. So I'm going to try for a live question from Ali, if he would like to unmute. Yes.
Thank you.
There we are. Fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned in your introduction that the United States have limited resources, yet its defense budget is superior to that of NATO allies, Russia and China combined. Do you think that the Pentagon needs to be restructured by reducing the number of worldwide military bases, which number over 800, and that would provide the US with the necessary resources to face up to the challenges posed by China and Russia? A second question, if I may, you actually criticized Germany. And do you think that Germany's stand at the moment is based on the fact that there are nearly 40,000 American soldiers based in Germany in several bases, and also the fact that Germany depends on Russian gas being channeled to the country? If they are involved in the problem, then of course, if Russia tomorrow stops giving them any gas, the whole country will come to standstill. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Excellent question. So, I mean, first of all, we should get, and Gideon I would certainly defer to his expertise on this, but the defense spending of the People's Republic is dramatically understated in nominal terms, both because, well, for a number of reasons. One is that the dollar goes, well, the yuan goes a lot farther than the dollar still. I mean, if you really, and when you're looking at military things, you need to be looking at purchasing power parity, not market exchange, because it depends on what you can buy at home. They're doing most of these things indigenously. So by that measure, China's already pretty significant. And then also China obscures or hides a substantial portion of what we regard as military spending in other portions of the budget. So I actually think there are some arguments that China may even already be close to exceeding our budget, which, you know, that's a kind of a novel argument. I wouldn't want to stake a flag on that. But China's defense spending is dramatic. Secretary Gates used to say, well, we spend more than the next 15 countries, but that number keeps shrinking because of China. The other thing is that the United States poses a fundamental problem. In the map of the globe, we are a world island. We are thousands and thousands of miles from our potential enemies, and the battles that we would fight are on their doorstep. They're operating from internal lines, et cetera. So our military problem is much, much harder. Not to mention that they're using catch-up mostly, whereas we're at the frontier of military technological development. So together, we really aren't spending. And of course, most NATO defense spending is pretty useless because it's designed to, you know, have guys sitting at a, you know, hospital or a useless border checkpoint. I guess that's what they used to do. But this is not the Bundeswehr of 1988, when the Germans had a very formidable military. I mean, the UK and the French and the Poles, I mean, are exceptions, but most European militaries are not practically useful in a high-end conflict like what we're talking about, or even deployable without significant American assistance. So I think and what you're saying though is, yes, I would actually prefer not to spend any more on defense. I'd love to cut the defense budget for the reasons Gideon suggests, because, hey, you know, why should the national security state get when we can put it on retirement or spend it on our kids' education or whatever? But that requires fundamental changes, which we have thus far been unwilling to do for a variety of reasons. And so, you know, there's no $100 bills lying on the floor of the Pentagon. I mean, trust me, people have been looking for them. And I think we're beyond that. You know, there's no magic bullet where we're gonna suddenly get a lot more bang for our buck. We're just gonna have to figure out other ways to do it. So, and I agree with you. Yeah, we are gonna have to close down. I mean, we should close down a lot of bases. Our military should not be actively operating in most of the theaters of the world. We're doing a lot of presence activities. Back in the Cold War, we were actually not that active in this way. We were really focused, other than the war in Indochina, pretty much on the Central Front. That was why we won the Cold War. It's because we were really focused, you know, and the Soviets never saw an opening. I mean, this gets into deeper waters, but I mean, after the end of the Cold War, our military started to do all this present stuff, partially to justify its existence. I don't say that in a negative way. It's just kind of reality of bureaucracies. We need to get back to the basics. You know, we could definitely lose a war in a key theater. And we need to, you know, my view, I say this openly in the US, is if you're in the military and you're not working on China, nukes, or a low-cost counterterrorism program, you should get a new job. You really should be looking, because, you know, if I had anything to say about it, and I think this approach has momentum, you're probably not in a growth industry. Germany, fundamentally, we need to change. I mean, I think over time, we're going to dramatically reduce our forces in Germany. I mean, why do we even have those bases, which were designed for the inter-German border? And people say, oh, we use them for deployment. Well, we use them for deployments to the Middle East, which we don't need anymore. So, and Germany needs to feel the pinch. And I'm willing to take the risk that Gideon suggests. And, you know, because look, I'm thinking about Americans. We can't go on like this. They're taking advantage. I mean, Gerard Ahot, the former ambassador of the United States of France, he put it well. He said, look, the best explanation for German behavior is ruthless self-interest. And that's what I've come to conclude. They talk like, you know, hippie protesters or whatever, but they act with a self-interest ruthlessness that's actually astounding. I mean, that countries that suffered under German depredation, including Ukraine, they're now refusing to allow arms to go to Ukraine, and they're buying gas from Moscow. I mean, it's astounding, but I think we have to accept it and deal accordingly. And so, you know, a critical part of US strategy in the future is going to be a much tougher line on Germany. It's going to be a combination. But, you know, obviously they're an ally, but, you know, an alliance is more like a business partnership. Obviously, a deep personal business partnership. But this business partner is now playing golf and embarrassing the firm and whatever, and things need to change to stay the same.
So I'm going to see if we can dial up another question. But Gideon, would you like to
No,
talk about
let's
Germany?
No, I mean, I'll leave it at that. Let's see what the questions are.
Right. See, we'll just wait for that. Nearly. So I'm going to try for Tim Cross. If you could put your question live by unmuting. No, that's worked really badly. Do you want to try that again, Tim?
If not, you can read it out for him, I guess.
No. Okay. Tim, that didn't work. I'm going to read your question out. If we could put it there. So the question from Major General Retired Tim Cross is, if the US should focus primarily on China and the Pacific and downsize or downplay their involvement in NATO and Europe, should it stay as the leader of NATO and stay signed up to Article 5?
Oh, yes, the United States should stay in NATO, but actually in the model, I think closer to what General and then President Eisenhower had, which is as the kind of I think we're the kind of convener, and we can provide the very high-end capabilities and the fungible capabilities, space, cyber, of course, our nuclear deterrent, other kinds of capabilities that wouldn't detract from our position in Asia. But for instance, I would be up for a European SACEUR. I mean, I think that would be a better, and again, that's what Eisenhower envisioned at the beginning and in the 50s. And that's more consistent with our interests. But again, also saying, hey, and I think the solution to the problem, Gideon, I mean, it's a formal solution. I'm not saying that it solves the problems that he points to, which are real, but would be, Germans in a collective defense situation. If we're worried about them rampaging around the continent again, which I don't think is too likely, but anything's possible. You enmesh them in the Lord Ismay model. But yeah, I mean, I think that whatever I think we should step back. And I think Gideon mentioned the Biden administration. I think they actually are not, in a way. I mean, you've got the sort of neocon crowd, which of course doesn't, the Rumsfeld descendants who don't want any European. But that I actually think that's a weakening. I mean, it doesn't deal with reality. And actually, a lot of the neoconservatives, I used to fight with, now they know that China is the reality, because a neoconservative is a liberal who appreciates power, right? And they have to recognize how powerful China is. And China is an overdetermined threat, because I would look at it more in geopolitical and balance of power terms, but it's also Marxist dictatorship. So it's kind of, everybody has a problem with it. And so, I think realistically, actually, you could get more policy creativity. I mean, I don't want to get partisan or anything, but you could get more policy creativity either from a Republican administration or a different Democratic administration that wasn't as wedded to the past. Right now, you have the ascendancy of the transatlanticists, and I think you can see that, I mean, in innumerable examples. But I think what we need is a much different and creative approach that says, all right, here's the problem that we face that's just not going to go away. And if we neglect it, it's going to get worse. What's the solution? Maybe it's a British SACEUR, okay. And we should help that. We should be there to support. We should break down barriers to technology transfer and weapons sales and support European industry where it's possible. But I think that, whatever works. But I to me, we have an interest in NATO, of course, but we have to make NATO fit for purpose of today's environment and the future environment.
The bitch fight that would ensue if you had to choose a European SACEUR between nations would be a reality TV to watch, for sure. So I'm going to ask another question. I'm going to read it out. This is from General Charles Vivian. And his question is, it must be important to maintain your credibility with your allies if you intend to both use them as a force multipliers and to help you in projecting influence and force. Do you consider that the withdrawal from TTIP and failure to invest in the Asian Investment Bank sent a message to Asian allies that the US was disengaging from the region, allowing China to assume that position?
Well, yeah, and of course, I don't want to should I go, or I don't want to?
Yes,
No,
please.
please,
Yeah.
Gideon. Well, excellent question. I mean, I question the basic premise in the sense that I think we have overassured our allies, and it's rational behavior. I mean, Germany has it great, and other countries have it great because they, occasionally a Secretary of Defense would go to NATO and say some mildly mean things, but in reality, everybody knew that it was hollow. So what we want our allies to be assured enough that they don't bandwagon with their threat, which is almost no chance of that among the Western and Central European powers in Europe. But we also want them to be, we don't want to overassure them. And we want them to bear enough of the risk and cost to do what we need in our business partnership. And this is LBJ put huge pressure on West Germany in the 60s during the balance of payments crisis. So this is actually something that we were better at, this burden sharing thing. We were much better at during the Cold War. We became drunk with our own power and unipolarity, and it's over. And we need to look at things in a much more realistic way. I think on the trade issue, you're right. Here's the thing I say about trade. I'm a blob dweller. I'm a foreign policy expert. What I think about trade is so immaterial. I formally supported TTP, but that just shows how irrelevant my view is. The fact is that there is a profound sense in the country across the political spectrum that the international economic model of the post-Cold War era was a massive failure and did not help regular Americans. And Catherine Tai ain't that different from Bob Lighthizer, and she was confirmed on a voice vote, which just doesn't happen right now. I mean, the partisanship in the United States is pretty intense. She was confirmed on a voice vote. So on the other hand, clearly we need to generate economic scale because and again, Gideon would know much more about this than I, and this is derivative, but 1.4 billion people, they have no data protections or privacy protections. So they're going to be able to use the benefits of scale. And if you look at like the AI commission that Bob Work and Eric Schmidt did, scale is really important. We have to be able to match that. We can't be an autarky, which is going to necessitate cooperation with, OECD economies. So my view is that we're going to have to go through. We're going to need. This is where political leadership that's going to say that it's going to connect. It's kind of a geoeconomic argument. It's not It's not the Bob Zellick argument. It's not. That's discredited. It's going to be more. Look, this is geopolitically necessary. It is in your interest, but we recognize that free trade is not a panacea. It's going to be more balanced, but right now I don't see it. But I mean, you're right. I mean, and Asian. Whenever I talk to the Australians, for instance, the first thing they say is, "Yeah, great, we're doing great on defense, but what we need is a regional trade agenda." And the Japanese are trying to backfill that. But again, this is partially a problem. The Japanese took advantage of us and the South Koreans for decades and decades, and now it kind of poisoned the well. So I don't feel too guilty about it. But it's a real problem, but I think it's going to require a politically realistic and sensitive, approach within the United States.
Thank you. Now we have, sadly, just under 3 minutes before we need to close. I'm going to ask both of you for some short closing remarks, and I'm going to start with, if I may, Gideon.
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks. It's been really stimulating to listen to all of this. Just a couple of quick points and then maybe a kind of overall one. On the trade issue, I mean, I was very struck when I was in Washington in October speaking to people doing Asia policy for the Biden team. And one of them said to me, if we don't have an offer on trade in Asia, we're going to lose this contest with China. Now, I think he may have been hoping that I would write a column saying that to kind of help his cause along. But
sounds like it. Sounds like it a little bit.
But I think that they did sort of. They are very worried about it, but they also know that the political realities that Bridge lays out are real. But it's a problem, and indeed you can see the problem growing because just this month, RCEP has launched, which is the new big free trade area in Asia. China's in it, Japan's in it, Australia's in it, and the US isn't. And that's an issue. Secondly, something that we didn't pick up at the time, but I was amused, kind of interested by Bridges' implication that AUKUS is a mistake because it's drawing Britain out into the Pacific, because it was obviously regarded as a great triumph here. But I have actually, even before AUKUS was signed up, heard some voices in Australia making similar points, saying, look, your military has got enough on its hands dealing with Russia and Europe, do you necessarily want to send half the fleet out to Asia? It's just an interesting debate. But lastly, listening to the discussion, without sort of resiling from the points I made about credibility being a kind of global issue, I think if you were going to try to pursue the kind of strategy that's laid out in the book and just now, and diffuse that threat of people just saying, well, America's weak, etc. One way of at least attempting it would be for a president to stand up and make a really major speech saying, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. Yeah. This is where we're going to put our resources. This is what we're serious about. And then people would at least say, okay, we can see the strategy there, and it doesn't necessarily mean that America is ceding the territory globally. Can I imagine an American president actually making a speech like that? I think it would be so controversial that they would never do it. But that's the only way I can think of avoiding these sort of false inferences being drawn.
Thank you. And final word to Bridge.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's possible. I mean, I think things that seemed impossible will become possible because of necessity. And I think exactly as you're laying out. And actually, I was having lunch with a European prominent ambassador of a prominent European country, and I was making a lot of these points very directly and bluntly. And I said, have I offended you? I'm sorry. And she said, actually, no, I appreciate it because now I understand. It makes sense. I think what I'm saying, it's not crazy, right? But we're acting as if we're living in a kind of an alternate universe. And I think we'd be all better off actually if we got on the same page, and people might not like exactly what I'm arguing that the United States should do, but they could at least grapple with it and negotiate with it. And in a sense, my view is that I'm actually the one who's really treating our allies well. I mean, if you're in a business together and you're heading towards bankruptcy and you're just ignoring it, I don't think that's helping our Eastern European allies. I mean, I told our Eastern European allies, I said, this is your problem. This is the reality you're going to have to deal with. Well, at least they have time to prepare if they listen to me, whereas if they listen to the Biden administration about not having any worries, well, then that puts them at real risk if and when we do fundamentally shift, which I think we have to. So, and that's in a sense, that's one of the reasons it's such an honor to be with both of you and the Global Strategy Forum, given its prominence and prestige and so forth. But I mean, one of the reasons I'm really trying to promote the book, especially with the United Kingdom, with Australia, Japan, Germany, probably virtually mostly, no, but is that I think it's best if we do this together. And obviously I'm thinking about America's interests, but in an enlightened way, right? I mean, in the sense that I think we can, we can do things together in a way that will make sense, but we can only do so if we're operating from relatively similar, assessment. And that's really what I'm trying to do. So that's why this engagement is such a pleasure and really a privilege to be able to talk both of you and your audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And before finally closing, this is the book. And just as a mark of how powerful and highly thought of the Global Strategy Forum is, if you go online to yalebooks.co.uk and you enter the code Y2212, you'll be able to acquire this at the remarkably good value price of only £21. And if you didn't catch Y2212, all of that is on the GSF website. So all it remains for me to do is to thank Bridge from Florida for being with us today and outlining his proposition, to Gideon for joining us to provide a counterpoint. Thank you both very much. Thank you to the audience for your questions and participation. And we look forward to seeing everybody back on the 1st of February for some Art Lau grant. Good afternoon.